Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. It's late July 2025, and for some time now we've been reading Leslie Feinberg's 120-part series, Lavender and Red, about the intersection of LGBTQ and socialist communist history. We are currently about a third of the way through that very long series, and in the most recent installments, and actually in a lot of the upcoming ones as well, Feinberg focuses on U.S. American communist and gay organizer Harry Hay, who was instrumental in founding the modern gay rights movement as we know it. I have at times been inconsistent in uploading this on a regular basis, although I was recently just telling the patrons that I was planning on committing to this on a bi-weekly basis until it was finished. However, after posting the most recent installment, I received the following comment, quote, "Hey man," little casual but okay, "are you aware of Hay's consistent longtime support for NAMBLA later in life? Usually purity testing, especially on the left, does more harm than good in my opinion, but Hay is the exception. He may be a good communist, but that doesn't make him a good person, and certainly not one that we should claim." End quote. So, if you don't know what NAMBLA is, I'm not going to explain it, look it up. But to answer the question, no, I was not aware of that. And I was not aware of that in part because I simply had not heard of Harry Hay before. And also in part because the source from which I heard of Harry Hay, this book, or this extremely long book-length series of articles, does not mention that. I have not read this thing before. I was reading it for the first time as I recorded it, but after receiving that comment, I went and did a Control F for NAMBLA in the document, it's not mentioned, and scanning the last few references to Harry Hay in the document, I can pretty confidently say that I don't think Leslie Feinberg dealt with it appropriately in the document. What do I mean by appropriately? Well, at least mentioning it, and if it was something that Feinberg thought was worth defending, or at least citing other people who were defending it. And if I were doing that, I would definitely also include some of the perspective of people who had attacked Hay for this within the gay community, because he in fact did receive considerable criticism over it. But simply not mentioning this, I think, is misleading to the reader. I feel I was misled. As I mentioned, I'd never heard of Harry Hay before a few weeks ago. But in that time, I have done what research I've been able to do on what exactly was this advocacy all about, which started in the early 1980s as far as I can tell and continued up to Hay's death in 2002. He never retracted the support. All of the sources that I read said that Hay was never a NAMBLA member, but that he had spoken at their conferences multiple times, giving speeches and statements of support, which were supported by his own personal anecdotes, so he definitely got very invested in that. In other words, it seemed to be more than a casual support for this organization. He also, in the 80s, protested the exclusion of NAMBLA from a lesbian and gay rights coalition, and even wore a sandwich sign indicating support for NAMBLA at a pride rally, which a lot of the other people in the community were vehemently against. In fact, because he had so much clout, because he was Harry Hay, he had originally wanted to carry a pro-NAMBLA banner, and the organizers managed to negotiate that down to just the sandwich sign. But still, there are photos of that online to this day. Also, I should mention that Lavender and Red was written between 2004 and 2008, so after Hay had died, and there was time to go through his entire history. So it was a choice on Feinberg's part not to address that whatsoever. Now, as I was recently mentioning in a video about the commenters, I started this channel mainly to read more and to be a resource to the left. For you as the listener, for anyone trying to evaluate Harry Hay, your opinion of this, your hypothetical position, could range anywhere from "it's totally fine, more of this please," to "it completely invalidates everything he ever did, and in fact anyone who ever spoke to him is now suspect." Most will fall somewhere in between. For me personally, I think it's indisputable, it's a historical fact that Harry Hay was a foundational part of the gay rights movement as we know it. However, that late life advocacy that he engaged in from about ages 70 to 90, after he had already made most of his contributions, does significantly taint the entire previous record. I would not say it invalidates it, but I will be honest, I would have a real hard time looking at somebody the same way after they come out in support of that. That for me crosses so many lines, it's indefensible. But Hay did have his defenses of it, and we will get to those in a second. But first, for another perspective, here is what Jacobin magazine had to say in its remembrance. Quote, "When he died at 90 in October 2002, many remembrances focused on Hay's late-life defense of the North American Man-Boy Love Association. While Hay never joined the group, he did defend it from being expelled from several LGBTQ conferences. His defense of NAMBLA was eccentric and troubling, rooted in his own experiences of teenage sexual activity, but it was a small piece of Hay's long life of writing and activism." Unquote. And factually that is true. However, like I said, once somebody comes out with that position, I would say that it doesn't historically undo the good things that you contributed to. Those are still there and part of the record, but from that point on, you're done. And honestly, you gotta wonder what was going on behind the scenes if that's the position you came out with at 70. It's kind of fucked up, to say the least. And I have read his defenses. I'm not gonna quote them in detail, because honestly, it'd probably be triggering for some people. You can read them on the NAMBLA website if you want, because they have a number of pages dedicated to him, where they recount his speeches that he gave in support of the NAMBLA mission, where he recounts, in some detail I would add, experiences that he had as young as at the age of 12 with men who were more than double his age. And he kind of frames it that gay boys are built different than straight boys, and that he was basically in control and could have stopped it at any time, but he also qualifies it by saying that he knew he was being, quote, manipulated, but not molested, unquote. Yeah, no. Just no. You know, even if that, for him personally, happened to be an experience, and I'm not going to tell him what he felt from that encounter, I can tell you that, again, I'm not gay, so maybe I'm not built different in that particular way. But I think that for most, you know, being fondled below the waist by somebody who was 25 years old when you're 12 would at least be a very confusing experience. Even if you didn't, in the long run, consider it as rising to the level of trauma per se, I think that it would be something that would probably be very disturbing to one's development. Let's also remember, children can't give consent. Although he's basically making the case that gay boys can, because, again, they're just different. I think the most charitable read here is that despite Hay's protest that this was a manipulation, not a molestation, it was a molestation. That's my personal opinion, and I do have sympathy for victims of situations like that. However, the sympathy ends when they become perpetrators, which we know is not an uncommon part of the cycle. So in that sense, NAMBLA and organizations like it are abuse perpetration advocacy societies. They're trying to legalize abuse. I'll say this also, that some of the rationalization that Hay seems to have employed was fashioned in part out of his anthropological research pertaining to changing social norms over time and really over millennia with respect to the subject. And he seemed to have taken an attitude that it was not modern straight society's role to tell the gay community whether or not they could have sex with children. In fact, he seemed to be building that into his definition of homosexuality. That if it wasn't mandatory, it was at least really common, and it wasn't straight society's place to tell them what to do. However, children can't consent, and that makes this a warped perspective that many in the LGBTQ+ community reject. And Hay, in fact, would not listen to them, considering them assimilationists. I would consider that nothing less than an abuse of his standing within that community as a founder of the modern gay rights movement. But whereas for most people, that includes equal rights to participate in society free of discrimination, for Hay and the NAMBLAites, that included additional rights, which are unsupportable in any context. This is actually a case where, but think of the children is a valid thing to say. Hay, in fact, countering this, went as far as to say that you're depriving gay boys of these important experiences with the older men, refusing to see the behavior of the older men as predatory, self-serving, and potentially extremely destructive to the child. Sorry, Harry, but the hypothetical kids who just need it that badly are going to have to, quote, go without. Now, there's also some speculation that some of this may have been born in part from the historical circumstances of everyone being in the closet for fear of being prosecuted just for being gay. And so these inappropriate cross-generational interactions may have played some role in a kind of passing of the torch or mentorship. However, the L in NAMBLA stands for love, meaning sex. And that isn't just giving of oneself on the part of the older individual. Coming back around to the original comment, it ended by saying he may be a good communist, but that doesn't make him a good person, and not one we should claim. There's a couple of things I want to unpack here. First of all, I don't know how good of a communist he was across the board, and good person is too broad to be useful. In other words, a person can make significant historical contributions without being everyone's idea of a good person, so that isn't necessarily that important. And as far as somebody that we should claim, I mean, you have to contend with the fact that Hay incontestably did, earlier in his life, make major positive contributions. You can't erase that, ignore it, sweep it under the rug. You do have to look at it and say, somebody who makes major historical contributions can also do really bad things. And we shouldn't get into this black and white, two-dimensional, put it on a postage stamp type of portrait caricature of historical figures as heroes to be put on a pedestal as though they were a saint in every aspect of their life. Doing something historically important also doesn't give you license to be an absolute piece of shit in other areas of your life. But I don't think we can just so neatly put it into the bucket of people we can claim or not claim as an entire person. Now, back to Feinberg and continuing this particular reading. I personally would be okay with reading more about Harry Hay, with this major caveat of what he got into later in life. But if Feinberg's going to write about him in a way that completely ignores that, I'm not sure that this is a reading I want to continue because frankly I feel misled by it. Now, if I were just reading this privately, I would just stop reading and move on with my life. However, I was reading it publicly, so I wanted to explain it. For those who want to continue reading it, you have the link. It's in the video description on the earlier videos. I had liked some of Feinberg's other work, like Stone Butch Blues, which I read and thought was an excellent book, but this one I gotta pause at least for now.